Don't let the little ones see you cry, Elena whispered, even as the first arrow split the air above her head. The world around her had become noise and smoke and winter panic. Horses screamed somewhere beyond the overturned wagons. Men shouted orders that nobody followed. Snow swirled through the burning remains of the convoy road, turning orange beneath shattered lantern light. Elena Whitmore stumbled against the frozen ground, her thin gray heeler's cloak soaked through with melted snow, ash clinging to her sleeves. She should have kept running with the others. Every instinct inside her begged her to disappear into the trees before the next wave hit. Omegas survived by staying out of the way. That was what the pack had taught her entire life. Stay quiet. Stay hidden. Stay alive. But then she heard the crying. Small. Terrified. Close. Elena turned toward the sound before her fear could stop her. Beneath the broken remains of a royal supply wagon, half buried under splintered wood and snow, two young boys huddled together. One couldn't have been older than 8. The younger looked barely 5. Their dark coats marked them instantly as royal blood. Silver wolf crests glimmered beneath the frost. Alpha King cubs. Elena's pulse froze. Oh no, she breathed. The older boy was trying to shield the younger with his own body, trembling hard enough for Elena to see it from several feet away. Around them, the battlefield had already moved on. Guards had scattered toward the front line. The attackers hidden in the northern ridge kept firing from the trees. Nobody had noticed the children were gone. Another arrow struck the wagon beside them with a sharp crack. The younger cub cried out and buried his face against his brother's shoulder. Elena looked toward the forest path behind her. Freedom was right there, 50 feet away. One sprint, and she could vanish into the snowstorm before anyone even remembered her name. Then the older child lifted his head. His silver eyes locked onto hers. Not proud, not royal, just scared. Elena's chest tightened painfully. Her little brother had looked exactly like that the winter fever took him. Alone, trying not to cry because he thought being brave meant suffering quietly. Another whistle sliced through the air. Elena moved before she could think. She dropped beside the wagon and pulled both boys against her chest just as a cluster of arrows slammed into the wooden frame above them. The impact rattled through the frozen ground. The younger cub gasped and clung to her sleeve. Elena wrapped both arms around them instinctively, curling her body over theirs as snow and splinters rained across her back. It's okay, she whispered shakily, though her own heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Stay down. Don't look up. More arrows fell. One tore through her cloak near her shoulder, close enough for the cold air to sting against her skin. Elena flinched, but did not move away from the children. The older cub stared at her in confusion, like he couldn't understand why she was still there. Most wolves would have protected themselves first, especially in Omega, especially one nobody important would miss. The little boy's tiny hands gripped the front of her cloak. Are we going to die? He whispered. Elena swallowed hard. Fear clawed up her throat so fiercely it almost stole her voice. But she forced herself to smile anyway, even with tears freezing in her lashes. Not while I'm here, she said softly. Then another shadow appeared through the smoke beyond the ruined convoy. Tall, motionless. A man dressed entirely in black stood at the edge of the burning road, silver eyes fixed on the Omega, shielding his sons beneath the falling arrows. And for the first time in many years, Alpha King Kale Thornridge forgot to breathe. The storm finally began to thin, but the cold only grew sharper after the arrows stopped falling. Elena could still hear distant shouting through the trees as royal guards swept across the snowy road searching for survivors. She did not dare move yet. The younger boy remained curled tightly against her chest, his tiny fingers twisted into the fabric of her cloak, like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. The older cub sat rigid beside her beneath the broken wagon frame, trying desperately to appear calm even though his breathing shook. Elena slowly brushed snow from the child's dark hair. It is over, she whispered gently. You are safe now. The words sounded fragile even to her own ears. Nothing about tonight felt safe. Not the smoke drifting through the forest. Not the silence between distant horns. And certainly not the tall figure standing several yards away watching her with those cold silver eyes. Alpha King Kale Thornridge had not moved once since arriving. Snow collected across the shoulders of his black coat, but he stood perfectly still beside the ruined convoy, like something carved from winter itself. Elena had heard stories about him her entire life. Every pack had. The king who conquered the northern territories before turning 30. The king whose wolf was so powerful weaker wolves lowered their gaze without realizing it. The king who trusted no one. She had imagined someone crueler somehow. Louder. Harder. But the man before her was silent, and somehow that silence felt far more dangerous. Several royal guards finally rushed forward through the smoke. Your Majesty, one of them breathed in visible relief. We found the eastern ridge clear. The attackers are retreating. Kill did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Elena and the two boys beside her. The younger cub finally looked up and spotted him. Father! The tiny voice cracked with exhaustion. In an instant, the child stumbled free from Elena's arms and ran through the snow toward the king. Kale dropped to one knee just before the boy collided against him. The movement startled Elena more than anything else tonight. She had not expected gentleness from a man like him. Yet the Alpha King wrapped one arm firmly around his son and closed his eyes for the briefest moment, as though the sight of the child unharmed had shaken something deep inside him. The older cub stood more slowly, proud despite his trembling. Elias was scared, he said quietly. She stayed with us. Kill looked toward Elena again, really looked at her this time. She suddenly became aware of everything at once. The tear in her cloak, the snow melting into her boots, the streak of blood near her shoulder where an arrow had grazed her earlier. She quickly lowered her gaze. I only did what anyone would do, she murmured. One of the guards behind the king let out a short, disbelieving laugh before quickly silencing himself. Everyone knew that was not true. Most wolves had run. Kale rose slowly to his full height, still holding the younger cub against his side. What is your name? He asked. His voice was deep and controlled, but softer than she expected. Elena swallowed hard. Elena Whitmore, Your Majesty. Something flickered briefly across the king's expression at the name. Recognition, maybe. Or memory. Before she could understand it, another guard approached hurriedly from the road. Sire, the northern medic tents are overwhelmed. We need every available healer immediately. Elena instinctively stepped back. Of course, that was who she really was here. Not a hero. Not important. Just another low-ranking Omega healer covered in soot and snow. She bowed her head quickly. I should go help the others. But before she could turn away, small fingers wrapped around her wrist. Elias stared up at her with wide, frightened eyes. Do not leave. The plea landed in the frozen air with painful softness. Elena's heart tightened instantly. Then she noticed something even stranger. The Alpha King did not remove the child's hand from hers. The royal medic tents smelled like smoke, pine resin, and melting snow. Lanterns swayed above rows of injured soldiers while exhausted healers moved from cot to cot with trembling hands and hollow eyes. Elena stood near the entrance table grinding herbs into a shallow wooden bowl, trying desperately to ignore the way everyone kept glancing at her. Word traveled fast through a royal convoy, especially strange stories. The Omega who shielded the Alpha King's sons had become whispered conversation before midnight. She could feel it in every stare. Some looked curious, others suspicious, a few openly resentful. Elena lowered her eyes and focused on crushing the herbs finer. That was easier than thinking about the king. Easier than remembering the moment his son grabbed her wrist and begged her not to leave. You missed a stem. The sharp voice made Elena flinch slightly. Senior healer Miriam stood beside the preparation table with crossed arms and a tired expression. Unlike Elena's worn gray cloak, Miriam's healer robes carried the silver crest of the royal infirmary stitched proudly across the collar. Sorry, Elena murmured quickly. She reached for the bowl again, but a sudden wave of dizziness rolled through her hard enough to blur her vision for a second. She steadied herself against the table before anyone noticed. Or so she thought. Miriam's gaze narrowed immediately. Sit down. I am fine. That was not a request. Elena hesitated before obeying quietly. The truth was she had not felt right since the attack. Her shoulder burned beneath the torn fabric of her cloak, and a strange heaviness had settled deep into her chest. Exhaustion, maybe. Shock. She did not know. Across the tent, several soldiers suddenly stepped aside at once. The entire atmosphere shifted before she even looked up. Alpha presence. Heavy. Cold. Commanding. King Kale entered the medic tent carrying Elias asleep against his shoulder. The younger cub's tiny arms remained loosely wrapped around his father's neck, completely unaware of the room falling silent around them. Behind the king walked Lucien, calmer now, but still pale beneath the lantern light. Elena instinctively rose from her chair too quickly. The movement made her dizzy again. Cale noticed immediately. His silver eyes flicked toward her shoulder where blood had begun slowly staining through the fabric again. "You are injured." It was not a question. Every healer in the tent suddenly became very interested in pretending not to listen. Elena touched her shoulder automatically. "It is only a scratch, Your Majesty." Lucien frowned instantly. "That is not true." The older cub stepped closer before anyone could stop him. "You were bleeding in the snow." Several nearby soldiers exchanged startled looks. Royal cubs did not speak to low-ranking omegas like equals. Yet Lucien stood beside Elena naturally, like he had already decided she belonged near them. Cale studied her quietly for several long seconds. Elena could not explain why his silence unsettled her so much. It was not cruel silence. Worse, careful silence. Like he was trying to understand something impossible. Finally, he turned slightly toward Miriam. "Treat her injuries personally." Miriam blinked in visible surprise before bowing quickly. "Of course, Your Majesty." Elena opened her mouth immediately. "Please, there are soldiers here who need help more than I do." Cale's gaze returned to her. "You protected my sons while trained warriors fled." His voice remained calm, but every person in the tent froze at the words. "You will be treated." Elena's cheeks flushed instantly beneath the attention. She hated this. The staring. The whispers beginning again. She had not saved the boys for recognition. Any child abandoned in that storm would have broken her heart the same way. Elias stirred sleepily against his father's shoulder, then suddenly lifted his head just enough to mumble one exhausted sentence. "She smells like moonlight." The room went completely still. Elena felt her own heartbeat stop for a moment. Because the instant those words left the child's mouth, something ancient and unfamiliar flickered across the Alpha King's face. The silence inside the medic tent lasted only a few seconds, but to Elena it felt endless. Nobody moved after Elias spoke. Even the healers stopped working. The little boy had already fallen half asleep again against his father's shoulder, unaware that his quiet words had changed the entire atmosphere around him. "She smells like moonlight." Elena lowered her gaze immediately, heat creeping into her face beneath the lantern glow. Children said strange things when frightened. That was all this was. Exhaustion. Stress. Yet the unease spreading through the room told her everyone else understood those words differently. In werewolf territories, moonlight scent was not ordinary. Ancient stories spoke of wolves blessed directly by the moon goddess herself. Rare bloodlines tied to healing, protection, and fate. Elena had heard those stories growing up. She had simply never imagined anyone looking at her while telling them. Cale Thornridge remained perfectly still near the center of the tent. His expression gave away nothing, but the air around him had changed somehow. Sharper now, focused entirely on her. "Olive, you," he said calmly without taking his eyes off Elena. "Leave us." The command landed instantly. Guards bowed and exited without question. The healers followed more slowly, though several cast openly curious glances toward Elena before disappearing outside into the snowy night. Within moments, the tent became quiet except for the distant crackle of firewood and the soft winter wind pushing against the canvas walls. Elena's pulse quickened painfully. She had never been alone with a king before, especially not this king. Cale carefully lowered Elias onto a nearby cot, pulling a heavy fur blanket over the sleeping child before turning back toward her. Even that small gesture unsettled her. The stories never mentioned kindness. "Sit down," he said. Elena obeyed automatically. Miriam had left a bowl of warm water and bandages beside the chair. Cale stepped closer and reached for the torn edge of Elena's sleeve. She tensed immediately. "Your Majesty, I can treat it myself. The bleeding has not stopped. It is nothing serious." "You are shivering." His voice remained calm, but there was something impossible to argue against in the way he spoke. Reluctantly, Elena allowed him to pull the damaged fabric aside near her shoulder. The scrape itself was not deep, but the skin around it carried faint dark discoloration spreading beneath the surface like frost beneath glass. Cale's eyes narrowed instantly. "Poison." Elena blinked in confusion. "What?" He looked toward the cot, where Elias slept peacefully. The arrows used during the ambush were treated with wintershade venom. A cold weight settled into Elena's stomach. Wintershade poison was expensive and dangerous. Even small amounts could weaken a wolf for days. But the boys are fine, she whispered. Kale's silver gaze lifted slowly to hers. Yes. Elena suddenly remembered the strange heaviness in her chest. The dizziness. The burning beneath her skin that kept growing worse. Her breath caught softly. No, she murmured. That is impossible. Kale said nothing for several seconds. Then he reached for her hand carefully, almost cautiously. The moment his fingers closed around hers, warmth rushed sharply through Elena's body. Not ordinary warmth. Something deeper. Ancient. It spread beneath her skin like silver light moving through frozen water. Elena gasped softly and instinctively tried pulling away, but Kale tightened his hold just enough to stop her. His expression changed for the first time since she met him. Not anger. Not suspicion. Shock. Real shock. The lantern beside them flickered violently. Somewhere behind the tent walls, several wolves outside suddenly howled into the winter night all at once. Elena's frightened eyes lifted toward his. What is happening? She whispered. Kale stared at her hand in his like he no longer recognized the world around him. Then very quietly, almost to himself, the Alpha King said, the bond should not exist. Elena stared at their joined hands as though they belonged to strangers. The warmth moving beneath her skin had not faded. If anything, it was growing stronger. Her pulse beat unevenly while faint silver light shimmered once beneath the surface of her wrist before disappearing again. She pulled her hand free abruptly and pushed herself to her feet too fast. The room tilted around her instantly. Kale caught her arm before she could fall. Careful. His voice lowered unexpectedly, almost gentle. Elena stepped back the second her balance returned. Distance. She needed distance. Everything about this felt wrong. Impossible. There is no bond. She whispered quickly, more to herself than him. I am not royal. I am not even highborn. Kale watched her carefully. Bloodlines do not care about rank. The answer unsettled her even more. Elena wrapped her arms around herself tightly, trying to steady the trembling building inside her chest. Outside the medic tent, snow continued falling softly against the camp, but inside the air felt far too warm now. Too close. She had spent her entire life being overlooked. Forgotten. Safe in her invisibility. Nothing dangerous ever happened to unnoticed girls. But kings noticing you? Ancient magic awakening around you. Those things destroy people. Your Majesty, she said carefully, refusing to meet his eyes. Whatever happened tonight was caused by stress or poison or confusion. When morning comes, this will disappear. Kale remained silent long enough for unease to creep beneath her skin again. You truly do not know, he said quietly. Elena frowned slightly. Know what? Before he could answer, the entrance curtain suddenly pulled aside. A royal commander stepped inside wearing heavy black armor dusted with snow. He stopped instantly at the sight of Elena standing so close to the king. Suspicion hardened his expression immediately. Sire. He bowed quickly before glancing toward Elena again. The council members are demanding answers regarding the ambush. Kale did not look away from Elena. Later, the commander hesitated. There is another issue. His eyes narrowed slightly. Some guards are questioning how an unknown Omega ended up alone with the royal heirs during the attack. Elena felt her stomach drop. Of course they were. Royal children did not simply disappear from guarded convoys unless someone failed. Or someone planned it. The commander's voice sharpened. A few believe the attack may have been coordinated from inside the camp. Elena looked up instantly. You think I had something to do with this? I think coincidence rarely exists around royal blood. The accusation hit harder than she expected. Shame burned across her face even though she had done nothing wrong. This was familiar. The way powerful wolves looked at Omegas when things went wrong. Weak enough to blame. Disposable enough to sacrifice. Kale's expression darkened slightly. Commander Vale. The quiet warning in his voice chilled the entire tent. She shielded my sons while armed guards abandoned them. The commander stiffened but did not fully retreat. Respectfully, sire, desperate people often seek advancement through unusual methods. Elena lowered her eyes immediately. There it was. The real fear beneath all of this. Not that she hurt the cubs. That she saved them. A nobody Omega standing too close to the throne made nobles uncomfortable. Kale took one slow step forward. The temperature inside the room seemed to drop with him. "You were 30 yards away when the arrows fell," he said calmly. She was not. Silence crashed through the tent. The commander's face lost color. Almost instantly, Kale's silver eyes never softened. "The next time you question her loyalty," he continued quietly, "remember whose hands carried my children out of the snow." The commander bowed immediately this time, far deeper than before. "Forgive me, Your Majesty." Kale dismissed him with a glance. The moment the tent curtain closed again, Elena released a shaky breath she had not realized she was holding. "You did not have to defend me." Kale looked toward her slowly. "Yes," he said, "I did." Then from the cot behind them came Elias's sleepy little voice through the dim lantern light. "Father." Kale turned immediately. The younger cub blinked awake and reached one small hand toward Elena instead of him. "Can she stay until I fall asleep again?" The Alpha King looked at his son for a long moment. Then his gaze shifted back to Elena. And for the first time that night, there was no coldness left in his eyes at all. Elena sat carefully beside the small cot while Elias drifted back toward sleep beneath the heavy fur blankets. The boy's tiny hand still clung loosely to her sleeve, refusing to let go completely even in dreams. Snow whispered softly against the medic tent outside, but the chaos from earlier had finally faded into distant movement and muffled voices across the royal camp. For the first time all night, the silence felt almost peaceful. Almost. Elena could still feel Kale standing nearby. Some part of her remained painfully aware of him at all times now. The warmth that had sparked between them earlier had quieted, but it had not disappeared. It lingered beneath her skin like moonlight trapped under ice. She hated how easily her body noticed him. The shift in air when he moved, the steady weight of his gaze, the strange calm that settled over the room whenever he stood close. None of it made sense. "You should rest too." Kale's voice broke softly through her thoughts. Elena looked up. The Alpha King stood near the lantern table, removing his dark gloves one finger at a time. Without armor and snow covering him, he somehow looked even more dangerous. Not because of strength, because exhaustion had stripped away some of the cold distance from his face. Shadows darkened beneath his silver eyes. He looked like a man who had not truly slept in years. Elena quickly looked away before he noticed her staring. "I am fine." Kale glanced toward her bandaged shoulder. "You keep saying that." A faint warmth touched her cheeks. She was not used to conversations like this. Most high-ranking wolves spoke over omegas, not with them. Especially not kings. Silence settled briefly again until Elias shifted in his sleep and mumbled something too soft to understand. Elena instinctively brushed the child's dark hair back from his forehead. The movement was small, gentle, automatic. But Kale watched it with an expression she could not read. "They trust you already," he said quietly. Elena smiled faintly without thinking. Children know when someone is trying to protect them. Most adults do not. The answer carried something heavier beneath it. Weariness maybe. Regret. Elena hesitated before speaking carefully. "You were afraid tonight." Kale's eyes lifted toward hers immediately. The entire tent seemed to still around them. Elena almost regretted the words at once. Nobody spoke to powerful wolves that directly, but she had seen it earlier beneath all the king's control. Fear. Not for himself. For his sons. Kale leaned back slightly against the wooden table beside him. "I arrived too late." His voice lowered almost to a whisper. "If anything had happened to them." He stopped before finishing the sentence. Elena's chest tightened unexpectedly. She understood that kind of fear. Loving someone enough to break for them. "But nothing did," she said softly. "They are safe." Kale stared at her for several long seconds. "Because you stayed." The quiet honesty in his voice unsettled her far more than anger would have. Elena looked down quickly at her hands. Anyone would have done the same. Kale gave the smallest shake of his head. "No." The single word landed with painful certainty. Before Elena could answer, movement stirred outside the tent entrance. Two older women entered carrying fresh blankets and medical supplies. The moment they noticed Elena sitting beside the royal cub while the Alpha King stood nearby, both women froze. Slightly. One of them, a gray-haired healer with sharp eyes, looked directly at Elena's face and went completely pale. "It cannot be," she whispered. Kale straightened instantly. "What is it?" The elderly healer stepped closer slowly, staring at Elena like she had seen a ghost. Then with trembling fingers, she reached toward the silver-shaped birthmark barely visible near Elena's collarbone where the torn fabric had slipped aside. A crescent moon surrounded by tiny stars. Elena instinctively covered it at once. The old healer's eyes filled with shock. "Moonborn," she breathed. The lantern flames throughout the tent flickered violently again. And this time, even Cale Thornridge looked shaken. Elena's hand remained pressed tightly against the mark near her collarbone long after the old healer stepped back in shock. The entire medic tent had gone silent again, but this silence felt different from before. Heavier. Dangerous. The elderly woman stared at Elena with trembling eyes, her face pale beneath the lantern glow. "That mark disappeared generations ago," she whispered. "The Moonborn line was believed extinct after the Southern Wars." Elena shook her head immediately. "You are mistaken." Her voice sounded smaller now, less certain. The healer slowly lowered herself into the nearest chair like her knees could no longer support her weight. "I spent 40 years studying healing bloodlines for the Royal Infirmary," she said quietly. "I know what I saw." Cale's gaze had not left Elena once. She could feel it even without looking at him. Calm, focused, watching every breath she took now like she had become some impossible puzzle placed suddenly in his hands. Elena hated it. She wanted to disappear again. She wanted tonight to end so she could return to the quiet healer quarters where nobody noticed her existence. But nothing about her life felt quiet anymore. "My mother had the same mark," Elena admitted softly before she could stop herself. The old healer inhaled sharply. Cale stepped closer. "Your mother?" Elena swallowed hard. She rarely spoke about her family. There had never been reason to. "She died when I was 14, she said carefully. "People said she carried strange healing abilities, but she never explained them to me." The older healer exchanged a quick glance with Cale before looking back at Elena. "What was her name?" "Catherine Whitmore." The woman's expression changed instantly. Recognition. Real recognition. "Moon goddess preserve us," she whispered. Cale's silver eyes narrowed slightly. "You know the name?" The healer nodded slowly without taking her eyes off Elena. "Catherine Whitmore vanished from the royal territories nearly 20 years ago." Elena blinked in confusion. Vanished. She was once invited to serve inside the palace infirmary after healing wolves no one else could save. The old woman's voice trembled faintly now. Then one night, she disappeared without warning. The records were sealed by the council itself. Elena stared at her speechlessly. None of this made sense. Her mother had lived quietly in a small northern pack. They had barely enough money to survive winters. Why would royal records mention her at all? Cale seemed to sense the panic building behind Elena's eyes because his voice softened slightly when he spoke again. "You did not know any of this." It was not accusation, only realization. Elena shook her head slowly. "No." Elias stirred sleepily on the cot again before opening his eyes halfway. The little cub immediately searched the room until he spotted Elena. Relief crossed his tiny face at once. "You stayed." Elena's chest tightened painfully at the soft words. She moved instinctively toward the bed and brushed the blanket higher around him. Lucien entered the tent moments later carrying a steaming cup between his small gloved hands. He stopped beside Elena naturally, as though it already felt normal standing near her. "The kitchen staff made tea for you," he said quietly. "Father said your hands were cold." Elena stared at the cup in surprise. Nobody important had ever noticed small things about her before. Cold hands, tired eyes, whether she had eaten or slept. She suddenly became painfully aware that Cale was still watching her reaction. "Thank you," she whispered. Lucien gave a tiny nod before glancing toward his father. "The council is gathering already." Cale's expression darkened immediately. Elena noticed the change at once. The fragile calm inside the tent cracked. Royal politics. Nobles. Questions. Suspicion. Her stomach twisted painfully. She understood now what frightened her most about tonight. Not the magic. Not even the bond. It was the attention. Because powerful wolves did not like mysteries they could not control. And somewhere beyond the medic tent walls, the Royal Council had already begun whispering about the unknown Omega suddenly standing beside the Alpha King. The Royal Council chamber had once been built as a war hall, and tonight it felt exactly like one. Cold stone walls towered beneath iron chandeliers while nobles filled the long crescent tables dressed in silver-trimmed cloaks and dark winter furs. The air smelled faintly of cedar smoke and tension. Elena stood near the massive entrance doors trying to keep her breathing steady while dozens of unfamiliar eyes turned toward her at once. Some curious, some calculating, most openly disapproving. She had never seen so much wealth gathered in one place before. Every instinct inside her screamed that she did not belong here. A low murmur spread through the chamber as she stepped further inside, escorted by royal guards. That is her, the healer girl? She looks barely 20. An Omega. Elena kept her gaze lowered. Beside the throne platform, Cale Thornridge stood motionless in black ceremonial clothing, silver eyes unreadable beneath the chamber torchlight. Lucian remained at his father's side while Elias sat wrapped in blankets near the throne steps, still sleepy, but refusing to leave the hall without Elena nearby. That alone seemed to disturb the council deeply. One elderly nobleman rose slowly from his seat. Lord Herrick. Elena recognized the name from whispered conversations among healers earlier that morning. One of the oldest council wolves in the north. Your Majesty, he began carefully. With respect, the matter before us concerns royal security. Yet this unknown Omega stands inside the war chamber itself. Elena felt the entire room tighten around the words. Herrick turned toward her with sharp pale eyes. You appeared beside the royal heirs during a coordinated attack. You display unregistered bloodline markings connected to extinct royal myths. And now rumors spread through the camp that the king's sons refuse separation from you. His voice hardened slightly. Do you understand how dangerous that appears? Elena's throat tightened. She had no answers for any of this. Only confusion and growing fear. I never meant to cause trouble, she said softly. Several nobles exchanged quiet looks at the sound of her voice. Too gentle, too human, not threatening enough for the fear surrounding her. Yet somehow that made them even more uneasy. Lord Herrick's expression remained cold. Intentions matter little in matters of the throne. Another council member stood abruptly. The Moonborn line nearly destroyed the southern territories during the old succession wars. Murmurs spread immediately through the chamber. Elena blinked in confusion. Destroyed. The noblewoman folded her arms sharply. Their blood carried strange powers tied to the royal bond itself. Wolves followed them blindly. Kingdoms fractured because of them. Elena took an instinctive step backward. This could not be true. Her mother had been kind, quiet, gentle. Nothing about her resembled dangerous legends. Enough. Cale's voice cut cleanly through the chamber. Silence crashed down instantly. The Alpha King descended the throne platform slowly, each step echoing across the stone floor. No one spoke while he crossed the room toward Elena. The closer he came, the more violently her pulse reacted. That strange warmth beneath her skin stirred again. Cale stopped directly beside her, close enough that his presence shielded her from the council's stares. While trained guards abandoned my sons, he said calmly. This Omega remained beside them alone beneath enemy fire. His silver gaze swept across the nobles one by one. Not one of you stood in that storm. No one answered. Cale removed the heavy black cloak from his shoulders in one smooth motion and draped it carefully around Elena before the entire chamber. The fabric carried the scent of pine, winter smoke, and something dangerously comforting beneath it. Shock rippled visibly across the council tables. Royal wolves did not cover outsiders with their cloaks. Not publicly, not possessively. Elena froze beneath the sudden warmth. Cale's voice lowered slightly, but somehow became even more powerful. Every warrior there chose survival first, he said. She chose my children. Complete silence followed the words. Then small footsteps echoed softly across the chamber floor. Elias climbed down from the throne steps, walked directly past rows of stunned nobles, and wrapped both tiny arms around Elena's side without hesitation. She stayed, he whispered. And in that moment, the entire royal court looked at the frightened Omega girl beside their king and realized she was no longer invisible. Long after the council chamber emptied, Elena still could not steady the trembling inside her chest. The castle corridors had finally grown quiet beneath the deep winter night, but whispers followed her everywhere now. Servants bowed nervously when she passed. Guards watched her with cautious curiosity. Even the palace healers no longer spoke to her like she was ordinary. Invisible girls were not supposed to stand beside kings. Yet somehow that was exactly where fate had placed her. A servant guided Elena through the upper palace halls toward temporary guest chambers prepared for her near the royal wing. The thought alone felt unreal. She had spent most of her life sleeping in healer barracks barely large enough for a single cot. Now thick carpets softened her footsteps while silver lanterns glowed against polished stone walls lined with ancient paintings of royal wolves. "This room is yours for the evening," the servant said quietly before bowing and leaving her alone. Elena stepped inside slowly. Warm firelight flickered across elegant furniture and tall windows overlooking snow-covered forests below the mountain cliffs. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and lavender. Too beautiful, too quiet. She wrapped Kale's heavy cloak tighter around herself instinctively. She should have returned it hours ago. Instead, she had held on to it through the entire council meeting like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Elena closed her eyes briefly. Everything had changed too fast. Moonborn bloodlines. Royal records about her mother. Strange magic awakening beneath her skin. And Kale. Especially Kale. The way he looked at her now frightened her more than the council ever could. Not because of power. Because she no longer saw coldness in his eyes when he faced her. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Elena turned quickly. The door opened before she could answer. Kale stepped quietly into the room, carrying Elias asleep against his shoulder once again. The sight immediately softened something inside her chest. The little cub's silver blanket dragged slightly across the floor, while his tiny fingers remained tangled loosely in the front of Kale's shirt. "I am sorry," Kale said softly. "He would not sleep unless he saw you again." Elena smiled before she could stop herself. That is not something a king usually apologizes for. Something almost like amusement flickered briefly across his face. "I am learning unusual things tonight." He crossed the room carefully and lowered Elias onto the large bed near the fire. The little boy barely stirred before instinctively curling toward Elena's side beneath the blankets. She sat beside him automatically, brushing dark hair gently from his forehead. Peace settled over the room in quiet waves. Kale remained standing nearby, watching them both in silence. Firelight danced softly across the sharp lines of his face now, warming the harshness that once made him seem untouchable. Elena suddenly realized this was the first moment all night that he truly looked tired instead of dangerous. "You should rest too," she whispered. Kale's gaze lifted slowly toward hers. "I have spent years afraid of losing everything important to me." His voice remained calm, but the honesty inside it caught her completely off guard. "Tonight, I almost did." Elena's chest tightened painfully. She looked down at Elias sleeping peacefully beside her. "But you found them." Kale stepped closer slowly until only a few feet separated them. The strange warmth beneath Elena's skin returned immediately, softer this time. No fear. No chaos. Only quiet recognition. "No," Kale said gently. "You did." Silence wrapped around them, while snow drifted softly beyond the palace windows. Then Elias shifted in his sleep and reached for Elena's hand beneath the blankets. The instant she took it, silver light shimmered faintly across the child's skin before fading into the firelight. Elena's breath caught softly. Kale saw it too, but this time neither of them pulled away. The Alpha King looked at the frightened Omega girl beside his son for a very long moment before speaking the truth both of them already felt. "The moon goddess chose you long before tonight." And somewhere deep inside the ancient bond awakening between them, Elena realized something terrifying and beautiful at once. For the first time in his life, the most feared king in the north no longer looked lonely.